Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Ethics Weekly. To our panel, we appreciate very much that you have returned. On our left-hand side, we have Mr. Jordan McCarty. And in the middle, we have Miss Vashti O'Cons. And over on my side here, we have Miss Jade Dion. Thank you very much for returning. Over the last few weeks, we have seen rising stories from Nauru, which would be the topic for our discussion today. And before we get started with the panel, we would like to review and give you a little background on what has been happening. Being the smallest nation in the world, Nauru was formerly known as the Pleasant Island, although since last year, this Pacific Ocean island country is more famously known for being Australia's detention centre. Currently, Australia is Nauru's largest trade, investment and development assistance partner. In 2012, Australia and Nauru had re-established an offshore processing centre after its closure in 2007. The centre has a purpose of processing asylum seekers' international protection claims. Today, the Australian and Nauruan government has received coverage over their OPC, which holds more than 500 asylum seekers, including 70 children. This all started when Australia saw a rising amount of boat arrivals transporting people without legitimate visas. Under the Howard government, these boats would be intercepted by the Australian Navy and directed to the processing centres. These asylum seekers were not detained under Australian, Nauruan or Papua New Guinean law. They were otherwise given special purpose visas while waiting for their process for settlement. Now, Media Watch from ABC News has made a series of pieces regarding the mediocre coverage for Nauru. Not long after re-establishment of the offshore processing centre, it has been said that Nauruan government has implemented media blackout, although Immigration Minister Peter Dutton has denied speculations to restrictions of journalist access. Despite this, several journalists who had tried to apply for entrance visa to Nauru came back with minimal success, only with the exception of journalist Chris Kenny from The Australian in 2015 and Channel 9's Current Affairs in 2016. Now, journalism in Nauru is a complex topic, and we understand that there are certain laws and policies which makes it difficult for a journalist to make certain coverages. This brings us back to today's debate, focusing on the Media Watch piece on the 15th of August, which transcripts I have here for all of you in case you'd like to look back for references and what has happened. Thank you. The discussion in this panel would focus on ethical issues, and my first question to the panel would be, what are the major ethical dilemmas that you can identify in this whole story, Miss Dion?
Well, firstly, the major ethical standpoint that I see being the first contentious issue is that the information that was a part of the leak, the big 2000 document leak, was actually illegally acquired by the media, and this is a major concern because this obviously influences the way it was reported. This wasn't necessarily reliable information.
Yeah.
It all comes into concern.
True, I'm sure that is an issue, but I think maybe the more contentious issue is the fact that after the leak, well, where was the reporting from the Australian journalists? I mean, what kind of virtues do they have if not going to even cover it in prime time? I think maybe the ABC. We saw something on the project.
Channel 10, the project.
Really out there, was there?
But we have to remember that there must be an ethical reasoning on why it's not reported at the first place.
So why would you think it wouldn't be reported in the first place?
I mean, even if we think of it in the Australian government's point of view, there's no benefit for them in reporting it.
Yeah, you do have many issues within Nauru itself. You've got asylum seekers that are self-harming, that are setting themselves alight.
And sewing their lips to get immediate attention.
Trying to commit suicide. This is obviously pretension. This is for a specific reason. They're not doing this for fun.
The reason,
it's an outcry.
Reasonings behind that, it could be egoism in the sense that it is very beneficial for them to get to Australia. But it could also be linked to altruism because by doing that, they're helping the other people, the other refugees or asylum seekers that are still in Nauru. Their voice would be heard. So it's kind of like a disguised egoism in a sense that they could go in Australia, but then their friends would get the attention that they needed in the first place.
In that way, in regards to consequentialism, what those asylum seekers did really comes into all three aspects of consequentialism, doesn't it?
In a sense that the outcome would be better.
Yes.
It would be good.
Speaking of it beneficial, even like the international outlets were getting all of this one, weren't they?
Yeah.
And even charging $100. If we're not charging, they were asking for $100,
And
which
it's
is
not
interesting.
just any international media outlets. We have the big names, CNN,
Guardian.
Guardian, Al
New York
Jazeera,
Times.
BBC, everyone was covering it except for Australia.
Yeah, Australian coverage
Very
is surprisingly
strange.
lacking.
Yeah, so instead of covering the Nauruan stories like the international media outlets did, what did we talk about?
Well, it was around the time of the Australian census fail, so that was heavily reported within the Australian media.
And don't forget those beautiful puppies that the Media Watch
Yeah.
team showed us at the end of their clip. There was more Labradors on the screen than there was Nauru.
Well, but who isn't happy to come home and watch the news to see
Exactly.
puppies?
Maybe that's the better news that we need to show the Australian people at that particular time.
There is happiness, and I feel like there's also justice.
So yeah, we've identified a couple of ethical issues here, which are quite significant. But I'd like to highlight this one particular issue, which is how Australian national media has stayed silent. So, Miss Dion, what is your take on our whole response?
From my perspective, deontology obviously is one of those kind of normative ethical theories which we deal with what's morally required, permitted, and forbidden. So as I see the role of the journalist, we are required to distribute this information.
Okay.
It's the requirement of the journalist, the duty, Jordan would say, of the journalist to report on these serious potential ethical violations that have occurred in Nauru.
But at first you were a bit contradicting yourself, because it wasn't legally right to distribute such information that hasn't been proven yet.
Very true.
But
She's
I
got
do-
you there, Jade.
Yes, so no, with that I do, and deontology is quite polarizing. It is usually black or white.
Yeah.
So the main plausible response for me as a deontologist to abandon that Kantian absolutism that is so critical to deontology is what's called threshold deontology. So it's at a point where the adverse consequences become so dire that they cross a stipulated threshold, and I then tend to lean my moral and ethical standpoint more towards Vashti's expertise in consequentialism, which were morally opposing theories, but when you deal with threshold deontology, up to an actual point, you're thinking about what is morally right and what you are required to do. So apart from fact-checking the data that was obviously released, it's still the journalist's role to distribute and disseminate the information the best way they know possible.
Yeah.
That's their individual agent-centered role in this.
Vash, what do you think about, like, from a utilitarian perspective, do you think it was right to leak those documents?
Yeah, I was about to say, in consequentialism, we believe in moral absolutism, so there's no absolute good and no absolute bad, just better or worse. So in this case, in my opinion, in utilitarianism as well, we believe in the greatest good for the majority. And the majority here, it doesn't necessarily mean the quantity, but it can also mean the quality. So the quality of life of the refugee, the asylum seekers, needs to be It needs to
be shown, because it
needs
could
to
be
be shown,
drastically
yeah.
increased. I believe so too, and I really think, coming back to the morals, from an Aristotelian ethicist sort of perspective, we look at moral virtues and intellectual virtues, and those constitute virtue ethics, which literally means excellence of character. Virtue is in Greek arade, which means excellence, and then ethos means character in Greek. So the journalists themselves need to show an excellence of character in what they're doing, in providing the news, disseminating the news. So not essentially doing their job, not showing the papers, the Panama leaks of Nauru, like they didn't distribute that to anyone. So what does that say about the justice for the people here, or the truthfulness? This is a true story, and yet they decide to show puppies. It baffles me.
It's down to the obligation of the journalist. And more prominent theorist in my field talks about your agent relative reasons for your action.
Yep.
As journalists, that's your agency. You have these roles, these obligations, and it goes further than permission. You're actually required, and it is your duty to report on this.
Yeah, and I know that, like you said, agent-centered there, which is obviously virtue ethics. There's no dilemmas. It's what the virtuous person should do. And this is where, like, I differ a little bit from you, Jade. Deontology, these are rules, these are permissions. You should do this. There's no real thought to it. You just follow things. For the virtue ethicist, really, it's what have these journalists learned? Their actions reflect their phronesis, their practical wisdom, and it reflects their own morals. So it highlights vices to me. This really comes under, I suppose, the golden mean for Aristotle in terms of moral virtue. So he sees pretty much every action as being dependent on virtue, and if not, then it's going to be excess or deficit of that virtue, so that'll be a vice. Now, there are four main Aristotelian virtues that would come across here for me, and that's courage, that's truthfulness, that's going to be justice, and then it's going to be temperance. Now, I know that Nick Carter said he didn't want to report on this because they didn't have enough facts for the case. The 24-hour news cycle doesn't allow that anymore. We have to get the information out there because other people will, and suppressing information makes it seem illegitimate.
I really want to highlight the fact that we also need to think of other stakeholders. Yes, for the refugee and asylum seekers, it would be better if it is reported. But then I would argue that the reason why the puppies and the census were the highlight of the news that day is because that it could create anxiety or riot if by challenging the authorities, because this is such a sad and controversial news.
In terms of it's false, right? Because if it's true, you should definitely report it. But I
we
understand.
don't know yet if it's true. Like you said, it's illegal.
Yeah.
It was leaked,
Yeah.
and the truthfulness of this is
True.
questionable.
And that's like, a virtue of Aristotle's is temperance. You need to have restraint, ensure that things are balanced before you pass them on and disseminate them. That's very true.
Yeah.
It does bring in what Chris Frost often talks about, that there are these groups in society, in particular the refugees and asylum seekers in Nauru, that are made particularly vulnerable to media abuse or oppression because of the vulnerable position that they are in. They're not in a position where they have authority over their own documents and their own cases,
Yeah, exactly.
their own
And this is
lives.
exactly
So
why.
we're almost at a point in Australian media where the story doesn't get told if
And this is exactly why we need journalists.
Yeah.
This is the point of journalism. We're the fourth
It's the
estate.
fourth estate,
We are the
yes.
watchdogs that are supposed to be looking at what's happening in the world, what's happening in Australia specifically, what is Australia's involvement. If Nauru is an Australian detention centre, and even if a quarter or a fifth or a tenth of these leaks are true, it's an atrocity. And it is the right of the journalist, it should be part of their moral value to bring this forward for, like I said, truth, justice, even the objectivity. You can balance this out, but you need to present it.
it's almost a gap between the intended ethical behaviour of the journalists and the actual ethical behaviour of the journalists.
Okay.
Even the Australian news sources that did report it, it'd be interesting to see what fact-checking was behind this, because again, as you were saying, truthfulness is one of the true pillars of journalism, and if that's not something that we're constantly underpinning, it becomes a even more deep-rooted ethical issue in journalism.
I'd just like to bring us back to the topic and come up with a resolution, since we've also run out of time and we need to reach a conclusion. So, from each of your respective fields, what would you have done to have prevented this, I would say, mess? From your own perspectives, what would you have done if you were the journalist or the whistleblower?
Well, again, there is no absolute good and bad. There's only what's better and worse. And I believe in the utilitarianism point of view, where the quality outweighs the quantity here, in the sense that I would actually prefer it to be reported so that the refugees and asylum seekers could have a voice and their lives could be improved. Just a chance for it to be improved because the case is out there.
Okay, Miss Dion, what's your take?
Well, obviously from a deontological perspective, I do consider the legal applications, and it is morally wrong to have leaked that information. It is a very black and white perspective, but
It's very black and white, yes.
you do end up you've got the Nauruan president who's now calling for a royal commission inquest into Nauru, and these are very fine lines for journalists to be stepping on. But you do reach that point where this is information that does need to be disseminated to the public. And it is so critical and important information that is not reaching the public, but is our role and responsibility as fourth estate journalists to provide this information to the public. So I think as a solution, the journalists involved in this case, is quite an in-depth case, need to remove themselves slightly from the 24-hour news cycle just to give themselves enough time and freedom of movement to perhaps fact check some of these things. So you don't have that potentially detrimental response to the public of
Anxiety,
uncalled for anxiety if these cases aren't actually true.
Well, we're still on the fence here with the resolution, Mr. McCarthy. What do you reckon?
So I might speak for a little bit here because there's a lot of things you mentioned that I kind of want to bring up in terms of virtue ethics. I agree. I think the 24-hour news cycle trend is terrible for this. Maybe this is breeding some of the deficiencies in virtues that I see in journalism in Australia right now. You know, here I really want to highlight what Mark Thorsby said. He's a professor from the University of New Jersey, City University, and he wanted to emphasize that, you know, for journalists, not just for journalists, for people to get to eudaimonia, you don't just do things that are going to cause you instant pleasure or going to put you in immediate satisfaction. That doesn't necessarily mean virtue. Sometimes people have to go through fear, have to go through anxiety, because it is not your own agent-related happiness. It is the society's happiness. It is human flourishing overall. So journalists should potentially go through hard times, and I think that getting these stories would have exactly meant that. A really interesting report done by Patrick Placence, actually, in the the Journal of Mass Communication and PR. Yeah, he discussed what exemplary journalists write about and what their virtues are. For those journalists, through his methodology, he found that it was the flourishing of journalists came from having a universal distinct code that was to benefit society. They're not thinking about themselves in these situations. So it might, in the case of Nauru, been difficult for journalists to get information, illegal to get information. I'm happy that the Panama Papers were released because that, from a virtue ethicist side, was the just thing to do.
Yeah.
But it's strange that it hasn't come from journalists. The journalists haven't been leading the way in this front. And
you do have to then look at the media outlets themselves, and that's why we got puppies, and that's why we got census fail over this. Is that sometimes stories are suppressed because it's actually the responsibility of the media outlets that are disseminating this information. We're in the age of Murdoch media.
Good point. Yeah.
So in terms of what Patrick was getting across when he was talking about where journalists flourish in terms of moral virtues, I think this links back to eudaimonia again, or the flourishing of people, the happiness of people. If we can act in this moral way, it's not going to just benefit our own morality, our own virtue, but it's going to benefit the entire society, bring us all to happiness. And that's the end goal, is it not? It's not fantastic for everyone to be in a state of happiness or a state of flourishing. So I really agree with that aspect. Yeah.
So from the expert's point of view of virtue
the
ethics,
journalists
you would
need to try and learn. They need to go back through phronesis and practice these virtues and stand for what they should be standing for as the fourth estate, and helping these people, and not letting them be silent because it's difficult or because there are other things impeding them.
Well, thank you very much. We have our different perspectives and resolutions from tonight. That was quite a productive discussion we had. Thank you for returning, and thank you for watching. Have a good night.